The story about the legendary surgeon doesn't end and continues to develop, and the dialogue between the guy and the girl is just beginning to continue, where Ray still manages to convince the girl that they still need her. His wonderful gift of negotiation, which he himself had accidentally discovered, made him feel really good, and he began to rejoice. But the girl still continued to be troubled by something, so she decided to ask him something unusual. She turned to him and wondered, could he stay to live with her? Such a question definitely stumped him, because he had never had to deal with this before, except in his past life, and that was unsuccessfully, so he was worried. The girl tried to calm him down, because they would have much more fun together. But Ray turned around and refused, which the girl obviously did not expect, and wanted to know the reason for such a sharp answer. He looked at her with a confident look, and said that he needed to go to the Holy Realm. She was also surprised, for she didn't understand what he had to do with them. But the guy explained that they had been looking for him for a long time. The girl was also puzzled, for why would they do that? But the guy was amused, and even embarrassed, because they all consider him really holy, and say that the priest received a revelation from the goddess herself. His friend was even more shocked and couldn't understand what was going on right now. Was he really a saint? But he uses mana to heal, not divine power. Ray believed himself to be a saint, so he laughed and said that there was nothing wrong with not getting a blessing, although he noted that he didn't know anything yet. The friend was shocked, for how could it be? A saint and no divine power? Between a saint and an ordinary person, divine power is the main difference. She moved closer to him and decided to ask him if he had used magic when he treated her. He exhaled and averted his gaze. He hadn't planned to do that. It was just that the situation was really urgent and required immediate intervention. The girl noticed that her illness prevented her from using magic. Yet she was conscious the whole time, so it was more like a curse rather than an illness. She remembered starting to glow and didn't understand how Ri was able to heal her with basic first circle magic. It completely overturned the whole idea of existing magic. Besides, is he really a saint, but without divine power? Perhaps we are witnessing the emergence of one of the most incredible saints in history. And Ray stood there and was just shocked, for still he himself had a hard time realizing it yet. The girl smiled and was also equally shocked, because exactly also before she had not encountered something like this in her entire life. She also tried to impress Ray, who looked at her, by saying that because there was still no way she could leave the village, she felt pathetic. She smiled and said that now they should start heading out. When they came out, there was already before them a vast army of the inhabitants, who knelt and bowed their heads before their chiefs, in token of respect. The girl came closer to them and was very aggressive, so she made them explain themselves for their words and actions. They looked at her and were very scared, so they started apologizing for their rudeness and for not taking her protection for granted. The residents continued to look at their leaders with fear and were ready for them to unleash all their anger on them. The girl looked at them again and was very happy. She realized that she had probably overreacted when she told them that she was planning to leave the village. She also exhaled and said that she could calmly understand why they were all angry at the elder. However, she hadn't done anything wrong either. Ray felt really funny about that. He realized that if people found out about it, they would all be in great danger now. But the leader continued to talk to them and accuse them, and added that they are not absolved of responsibility because they didn't even try to find out anything. You are all to blame, but you should show respect for your elders, for if there is no elder, there will be no elf who can be responsible for the village. The residents continued to kneel with their heads down, making it clear that they had already realized everything and understood their mistakes. She was very pleased to be respected and listened to, so she smiled back at them as well. Whereupon the girl waved her hand, and since she had already calmed down, To smiled at once and asked, How about having a feast in honor of her savior? The boy was shocked by this, for he remembered what had happened to him during his first visit here. It was not apparent that he was excited after all, but he was tired of tithing, very curious and inquisitive. What was the feast after all? Meanwhile, some really strange things started happening in the bushes. It looked like a really real massacre had started there. At this moment, 3 warriors were already there, fighting a huge monster that was apparently guarding the forest from danger. The most important one ordered them to immediately try to focus on the target, for they needed to clear the path immediately. She waved her hand and used the exact same magical power, as today was the day they were bound to end it already. Meanwhile, the camp was not quiet either. Everyone was milling about and looking for Mistress Iriel. The warrior commander informed her that it looked like they would make it to the elf village within the day. She was drinking coffee and wasn't very satisfied. Maybe their scouting team wasn't that big. After all, didn't the commander think the search was taking too long? She looked at them again with her beautiful eyes and asked them what they thought about it. But he decided to reassure her, because there are really a lot of different monsters in the city. So they are moving relatively slowly, in her opinion, although he, on the contrary, thinks that everything is moving really fast. She continued to drink to calm herself down. Still, she should have gone alone. It would have been much quicker that way. The commander began to cry and apologized to her for the inconvenience. She finished her coffee and threw the mug on the table, on which it began to wobble and nearly shatter. Immediately afterward, she stood up and ordered all of her soldiers to get up and get ready to move on, for they had already rested enough. The sky was blue and the weather outside really was perfect for a walk. Ray still continued to be in a bit of a state of bewilderment and euphoria. He was pleased to be receiving such a large portion of attention in his direction. Everything around was decorated by the locals, and they created a festive atmosphere. Ray looked at the little town and didn't fully understand what it was all about, or why such training was necessary. Locals danced and cheered. Some were looking for a new date, and some were just enjoying themselves and celebrating their leader. Someone walked up to Ray and started tapping him on the shoulder, catching him off guard, which was unexpected enough for him. Fia called him over to her place, as everyone at the party was already waiting for him. She started smiling and asking why he was standing there, because he was the main character of the party. He was pleased even though he thought the party would be more modest. "You are the savior of our village. How could we make a lesser celebration for you? There's just one small nuance. The girl will not be able to attend the holiday because she had some really very important things to do, so she wished him luck and said that he would manage without her." Ray was clearly unhappy with this outcome and asked where Fia was planning to go. She placed her hand on her holster, which held a large dagger, for the safety of the village could be jeopardized more during the holidays than on other days. It was at such times that the guardian must be most vigilant. She waved her hand at him and wished him a pleasant rest, informing him that they would meet later, while the guy still continued to stand in bewilderment. It was obvious that he was clearly agitated and worried about something as well, so there was nothing left for him to do but hope that everything would be all right. He gave another shout to the girl who was already walking away. "Fia, I'll find you tonight. We'll eat something delicious." She was clearly shocked at such a statement, and it seemed to make her angry. She ran up to the guy with red burning eyes and lifted him above her, asking if he really meant it all now. Fia was still just surprised. After all, no one had ever said anything like that to her before, especially since they also wanted to come to her. Ray noticed that the girl was very nervous, but he didn't pay much attention to it because he realized that she lived in the forest all the time, and it was unusual for her. Then she let him go and ran away sharply, for she had to run away. In parting, she shouted to the guy that he would definitely come to her, because he had made his promise. He lay very happy on the ground and didn't mind doing it. If it would only make her happy. It looked like he was really starting to fall in love with her. He looked at the festive village and wanted to walk around it. To one side, local guys stood around and competed to see who had the strongest pumped arms. And on the other, Ray was surrounded by several pretty girls at once, who started grabbing him wherever they could and asking him to go along with them. The guys also did not leave him alone and invited him to the table, where a lot of delicious food was prepared, which he loves so much. He was, of course, grateful to them, even though the whole thing had really worn him out a lot. The house, which is located in a large and powerful tree, immediately received information. Opened up old doors that were long overdue for replacement because of the unpleasant creaking noise they create. On the table was a cup of tea that had literally just been brewed, and everyone was asking what happened. Why did the chief guest leave the party that was organized in his honor? He clutched his head and began to smile, as he finds such activities difficult, and there was no other quiet place to be. Ira smiled and said that since this was the situation, then let him settle down as he pleased and start resting. Ray stepped closer to her and had no way of knowing what that wonderful scent was. It made him smile at once, for were they really the same flowers that grew at the entrance? That's right. Today is also a girl's special day that she is celebrating in this way. So she would like to share this beautiful moment with her boyfriend, and also poured tea into his mug. He immediately began to enjoy this drink, as it was just what he needed in this weather. But still, he was still stuck with the question he so wanted answered. So he approached Ira and asked why on earth she wasn't going outside. She smiled and said it wasn't at all appropriate to talk about such complicated things over a mug of tea. So Ray apologized and said it wasn't appropriate at all if she wasn't ready for such a conversation. Ira thought for a moment. After all, there was no point in her hiding this information, so she began to contemplate where to start. A long time ago, there was a conflict between the common elves and the higher elves. It's all about the fact that high elves have a different status from ordinary elves from birth, so it's customary for high elves to be respected regardless of their age. However, an ordinary elf had a conflict with a young elfess of higher bloods. This forced her to leave the village, which had some consequences. She smiled and looked at the guy, for he himself knows what happened after that, doesn't he? He was shocked at the information he had received. Was she really not coming down for another conflict like this? Ira was very upset, so she didn't even know how to choose the right words. Suddenly her eyes opened abruptly and she saw something strange. It looked like what she was so afraid of had just happened. She turned sharply and looked back. She needed to act immediately, for every second mattered now. Ray also got excited and immediately asked her what had just happened. She put her hand on the table and said that something terrible had happened outside the village. But Ree was still trying to ask her for more details on what she meant. It's all about the fact that uninvited guests have just paid them a visit, and they need to prepare for battle. Ray stood there in shock, for he didn't understand who she was talking about. As a sudden realization also came to him, were these really the same people who had started his search? As we entered the village, the sun began to set over the horizon, and slowly night fell, which also brought fear. Fia stood and prepared to guard her home, not realizing what the humans had forgotten here. They also came here with an army of warriors, which would not go unnoticed. So she drew her dagger and prepared for a battle that could possibly be one of the last in her life if something went wrong. The chief of the army stepped forward and removed her helmet, announcing that they had come to this land in peace. She smiled and said they were just looking for a saint and would like to see him. But Fia wasn't in a very friendly mood. It looked like she was ready to fight to the end. So Fia, without wasting a second, started shouting in their direction and asking what people were here for. On the contrary, they were shocked at the sight of the elf, because they knew about them only thanks to rumors, and did not even suspect that they existed in reality. But Fia wasn't quite ready to have a peaceful dialogue with them, so she was already ready to pull out her dagger and start a battle. But still, before doing so, she decided to clarify the reason for their visit. The commander looked at her with a smile and said they were looking for a saint and wanted to see him. Fia immediately realized who they were talking about now, so she tried to keep Ray and the village safe by saying that he wasn't here, and they should have left. But the girl wasn't going to do that, and with her arms spread out began to walk closer and closer to the elf, trying to talk to her and questioning her. Perhaps she had met the white-haired guy after all. As soon as Fia heard that, she immediately remembered Ray and clearly understood that they were talking about him now. It was very creepy for her to realize this, because her new friend, or maybe even future boyfriend, was now in jeopardy. The commander smiled, because she realized that with this question, she had achieved her goal and found out all the necessary information. She was happy that they had managed to find out where he was, so she immediately informed her army. Fia yelled out that she had absolutely no idea who she was talking about right now. But she didn't believe her, because she knows this boy, right? After saying that, Fia became very aggressive, and her anger began to overflow. But the commanderess continued to stand with her arms unfolded and tried to calm her down, informing her that they had come here in peace, and only in peace. All they wanted was a chance to see the boy and talk. She looked towards the elf and informed her that they would leave as soon as they reached their goal, so she could help them do so in return for a reward. But Fia was not prepared for this outcome and immediately drew her dagger from her holster, making it clear that there was going to be a battle now, and she would not make concessions to them. The army was also shocked by this outcome, and some of them were also scared as they were not prepared for this. The commander grabbed her head and was clearly upset, because it looked like she wouldn't be able to avoid bloodshed this time. But without giving up hope, she once again turned to the girl and told them to just give it to them and absolutely no one would get hurt. But Fia reported that Ray saved them, so for the sake of his protection in the village, absolutely everyone in the village will gladly stand up to them, protecting the guy. The girl looked at her with a perfectly calm face, which still showed moments of misunderstanding. If you keep standing in our way like this, a holy war could break out. With a smile on the outside, she asked if she was really ready for this. From such a question, Fia almost fainted and became very frightened, because she had never encountered such a thing before. She looked at them and realized that these were guys from the Holy Realm, and they definitely didn't come here in peace, even if you made concessions to them. So she clenched her teeth and was fully prepared to give her life defending the village, and that's not easy to do. You need great willpower and those people you wouldn't spare to give your life for. Fia drew her dagger with a sharp movement of her hand, making it clear that there would be no peaceful solution, and she was ready to confront them. The commander looked at her and realized that meant she was choosing war. Fia was very angry, so she asked, "Isn't this what people always wish for so much?" The girl raised her hand and pointed towards her opponent with her index finger, leaving the question unanswered. She ordered her warriors to remove it, so they immediately began to do her bidding. Fia was prepared for this, so she waited for the crowd of frightened soldiers who were already approaching as close to her as possible. Suddenly, she began to glow, and some magical glare appeared around her body. It looked like something strange was starting to happen right now. The soldiers were also frightened and started screaming in panic as the girl disappeared right in front of their eyes. A second later, she was already at their backs, and with a sharp thrust of her dagger, she delivered a crushing blow to their necks. After which, she flew through like a bullet, piercing her opponent. The commander watched her and realized that the girl was actually strong, at first glance, but it wasn't that simple. After analyzing her fighting style and how she deftly dealt with the entire army, she wouldn't have thought that Fia possessed an entry-level blade aura. In addition to the soldiers, there were also priests in the army who began to pray during the battle, asking God to give protection to their bodies as well as their soldiers from enemy attacks, receiving a blessing. After activating divine protection, they also asked him to heal the wounds that had been inflicted by the enemy, which immediately began to happen. Sophia began to attack the priests as well, who began to hinder her a lot by reviving their warriors. The soldiers began waving their arms and shouting that the enemy was much faster than they thought, so they needed to get ready as the priests tried to help their other colleagues. One of the soldiers drew his blade and threw himself further into the fight, which was moving into its most active phase. The priest was trying to heal injured co-workers who were already lying unconscious and had practically said goodbye to this world. But Fia was able to catch up to him as well before he used his healing. It was very difficult for her, because there were too many of them, and they were getting back on track very quickly with healing magic. So if things continued like this, she wouldn't be able to stop them. She started to panic a bit, and a cold sweat appeared on her face, which informed us and the world that the situation was really not easy, and it was worth making a decision instantly. So she looked at the commander and realized that she could be her next target to eliminate first to stop all of this. She skillfully and without respect stepped over the defeated soldiers and ran in her direction. And in just a second, she was at the side of Iriel with the dagger, who did not worry in any way and remained calm. Perhaps she had no idea of the danger that was coming at her. On the battlefield, a very strong thump sounded, the sound of which spread out for several kilometers. Fia was startled, for clearly she had not expected this outcome of events now. Her strike was stopped by Iriel's simple magical defense and bare fists, causing Fia to hover in midair with complete incomprehension and rejection of the situation. She smiled and looked at the girl, letting her know with a smile that this was the difference in strength. After these words, she clenched her fist tightly and without much trouble broke the very magical dagger that the girl had fought so long and skillfully with. Taking advantage of the situation and the fact that her opponent was shocked, she immediately charged her fist with magic and prepared to deliver a powerful blow. It was indeed very strong, as there was even a fire flash after it hit. Fia flew tens of meters upwards and was defeated. She had never had to fight opponents of this level before in her life. So with great speed, she fell to the ground, gathering dust and all the dirt that was on the ground with her body. Iriel calmed down and looked at the girl, asking if she really wanted to continue all of this. Fia looked at her opponent, who was rather blurry due to the fact that her vision had not yet fully returned from the blows she had received, and sighed. Covering the injured part of her body with her hand, she was very determined and made it known that she would never let them pass on. Iriel was amused by this, so she praised Fia for her persistence, even though it was really stupid of her. She stepped closer to her and asked her to make the most deliberate decision possible. No nonsense. Just give them the saint, and that would end all suffering and no one would get hurt. But Fia was determined and wasn't going to make any concessions at all, so she activated her magic ability and dragged the first stick she could find to her hand. This was her magical weapon for the first time, with which she was going to continue to confront Iriel, who still stood as calmly as possible and watched the situation with understanding. Fia was wounded, but she was ready to fight. There was no way she was ready to give it to them. Help was on its way. Ray and his friend were still on the way and rushing to come to the rescue in time. The boy kept asking how much farther they had to run, but the girl reassured him, informing him that they were very close, and she could already feel them not far from her. They tried their best to run as fast as they could to get to the place in time, most importantly, so that it wouldn't be too late. Ray visibly began to get nervous, for he didn't realize how many of them were there and how. And had they really amassed an entire army? What they saw shocked them. They could not even say a word for a very long time, because they did not expect to see such a thing. There was blood everywhere, on the ground, on the trees, and even on the flowers. The battle was indeed very terrible, and the loudest in the history of the village. Rei saw Fia, who was surrounded on all sides by an army of soldiers, and started shouting to her, trying to support her and find out what happened. She was already very hurt, and her strength was running low. The girl was really struggling, especially after the missed blows that Iriel had given her. Rei was scared, so he immediately rushed to her aid, pushing all the warriors in his way, ordering them out of the way. They saw the gray-haired guy and were shocked. Did he really come to her rescue himself? Everyone was shocked, for was this really the saint everyone was talking about? They knelt down and saluted him, making it clear that they were ready to do his bidding and listen to what he told them. Iriel also stepped closer to him in her soiled heels that were completely stained from the battle, after which she also informed him that she was indeed very happy to meet him. She was all battered and dirty, but still introduced herself, calling herself Saint Iriel Biliaz. She was really very uncomfortable with her appearance. But Rei was very angry and looked at all of them with contempt. He didn't want to listen and take it all in, as they had caused a lot of trouble for his girlfriend. He turned to Ira, trying to find out if she was really thinking exactly like him right now. She ordered everyone to stay where they were, and Rei to stay away from Iriel. Besides, if they don't want to die, they shouldn't block her path. The soldiers were shocked at such a statement, but they couldn't do anything, so they just stood still with incomprehension. The guys rushed to their friend's aid, trying to find out how she was feeling and saving her from a further battle that was clearly not in her favor. But Fia was in a state of shock and kept saying the phrase to herself. "Stop. I must stop her and not let her into the village." It was evident that she had no more strength and was badly wounded, for right in their arms she began to faint and fall to the ground. But the boys caught her. She started bleeding all over, and her shoulder was very badly wounded, all the while having to fight alone. It was necessary to set the bone to put her out of such agony. But it would hurt a bit. But Fia was prepared for this outcome. There was no other way out of the situation. Iriel began to approach the saint, and with a smile invited him to go to the holy realm from which they had come, for everyone had been waiting for his arrival for a long time. But Rei certainly didn't care about that right now, so he ripped open his t-shirt with a sharp hand, trying to make a peace tourniquet to bandage the wound. After that, he immediately rushed to his friend's aid to relieve her of such torment and cure her. Iriel was not appeased and reported that he was the one chosen by God himself. A great achievement. So it was time to reveal Rei to the world. He was shocked, as he clearly hadn't expected to hear such a thing. So he asked Iriel to repeat what she had just said. Was she really talking about accomplishments? That's right. Isn't that an accomplishment where you are doing God's will? From this point on, they have a lot of work to do. Rei was in incomprehension because he could not realize what they wanted from him and what exactly she was talking about. He looked at Fia, who was in critical condition, and asked, could they talk about such things now that she was not well? But Iriel was ruthless and informed her that all this was just a consequence of her refusal to obey her request. She could not go against God's will, so she offered her a reward and also warned her that otherwise force would have to be used. But she still refused. Waving her hands, she said they didn't kill her after all. But Rei understood absolutely nothing. Was invading their territory and taking him by force normal behavior? But Iriel informed with a calm face that they had no other choice. Rei was surprised. Did they really think he would just follow them obediently after all they had done? Iriel's eyes lit up, and she began to threaten him, saying that she wouldn't want to use force on a saint. Iris started to get angry as well. After all, she was amused to hear such things. Apparently, it wasn't enough for the army that they had invaded their territory. So they also dared to threaten her savior? So she got angry and suggested that Iriel reveal all her power to her. But Iriel informed them that the power of the Holy Realm would be no match for some elven woman. Ira was ready to fight, And since she was so confident in her words, why not put it all to the test and see who was stronger? The soldiers immediately surrounded her and asked her how dare she speak like that. It is not right to attack the safety of a saint. But with a simple force of thought, she broke instantly all of their weapons, which were already definitely not combat ready, just as Iriel had done to her friend. They were shocked, for they did not understand how such a thing was possible, though they had already seen so much today. Ira continued to look at them with contempt and hatred. She was ready to destroy each and every one of them. The soldiers were ordered to fight even without weapons, so they were frightened, but they still began to obey the order. All of this lasted until one of them fell to his knees and started begging Ira for mercy and asking for forgiveness. Ira laughed, for was this really the power Iriel was talking about? It looked like she couldn't get anywhere with these guys. Iriel also became saddened by this. It means their faith in God is weak and needs to be corrected. It also made Ira laugh even more, because did she really think that God was really able to give her power? In fact, they are all just limited by their faith. Iriel wouldn't stand for it, so she immediately activated her magical powers and was ready to fight, as such statements hurt her self-esteem a lot. She wasn't happy about Ira talking too much, so she threw herself into the fight, even though tears were already starting to come to her eyes. Ira smiled and used a grab that should help her in this battle. And it did work. Iriel was terrified, for the first time in her life she had been captured and disarmed by magical chains, something she clearly could not have expected. Ira laughed and asked, "What was it like to call yourself the power of the Holy Kingdom and be stopped by some elfis?" Iriel was startled, but still asked, did she really think the Holy Kingdom's powers ended there? Panic began to take its toll, and she announced that she would take Ray back to her lands at any cost, even if she had to pick him up piece by piece. At this point, the birds began to fly away from the scene of the battle as they realized that the situation right now was starting to heat up. Ira slapped her and ordered her to shut up, and not to speak in a tone like that, something she clearly wasn't used to hearing towards herself before. If it's enough for her to take his body, then the guy's life is really precious to her. So she can at least use her powers now and show what she can do. Iriel was terrified, for Ira had said he had no problem wiping out her disgusting country, and her along with him. But Ray asked her to stop and stop bullying, for he himself had said he was going to go to the Holy Kingdom. This made Iriel very happy, for she realized that right now she would definitely be saved. Only he was going to do all this for a reason. He had certain conditions for it to happen. The guy still continued to stand there looking at Iriela. It was very important for him to get exactly what he wanted. She was also very much shaken and aroused, so she didn't fully understand what the guy in question wanted to get from her this time. Ray showed his finger and said the first thing he wants to do is that he will now call himself a saint for no God's sake. He will become a saint precisely at his own will and can also cease to be one when he wishes it. And Iriela was very much surprised because she was obviously not prepared for this. She had absolutely no idea what to do now and how to react to it. How would it stop being holy? It's really unacceptable. But the guy was determined and immediately made the second point of his conditions. If something like this happens again, he doesn't know what he will do about it. In this way, he made it clear that he did not plan to tolerate any more of this kind of behavior towards himself and his friends. The girl was scared. Vitya, she didn't even realize how he would react. How would he act in such a dire situation? But the guy just threw up his hands and said he might leave the Holy Kingdom and become a saint in an enemy country. Iriela looked at him with bewilderment, for she did not understand how a saint could give a god. But still, she calmed down, because if he could betray a god, he would lose his divine power. So she wasn't completely worried, and asked perhaps if there was anything else the guy wanted to get. And in the third but equally important condition is that he wants to use any library in the kingdom to study and gain new knowledge. The girl rejoiced very much from such a point, for indeed it is very easy to realize. But the conditions didn't end there, and the guy immediately put forward a new one, which made everyone around him a bit surprised. From now on, they will all pay him compensation for his work, and also the other important things that they have to give him: clothes, food, and housing. And if they are able to give him all of these things, then he agrees in principle. But Commander Shi was really surprised. After all, she had never heard anyone request compensation before. What did he mean? Ray started yelling at her, because really, did she not know what he was talking about? This is real money we're talking about. Iriella almost fainted from this, for she had never seen such insolence before. Already even the priests had begun to shout in her direction that it was definitely not worth it, for a saint could not make such conditions. They all began to talk, for how could a saint ask people for money? I'm sure he's not a saint at all, and God chose him wrongly. Hearing this, the girl was very much surprised, for perhaps it really was all about a mistake. She opened her eyes and looked once more at the saint, saying that they were willing to accept absolutely every condition except the first. But Ray started laughing and waving his hands, for the first condition was really the most important. The commander from this outcome of events once again fainted and did not even know how to properly negotiate and react to such a situation. So she asked the Lord's help to cope with all this. And finally, it's time to announce the fifth condition. Ray pointed at Fia, the same village keeper that Iriella had beaten very badly with her soldiers, then ordered her to apologize for her actions. He was very aggressive, so he ordered not just to apologize, but to do it really sincerely. After saying that, he looked at Ira and asked her to untie Iriella to let her dialogue freely. She lost her balance immediately after this, and began to fall as the chains no longer held her. Iriella fell to the ground, and sadly began to say that she couldn't do that, meaning she wasn't willing to apologize for her actions. She looked at the guy again and asked him to consider her position as a saint who was doing God's will. Ree looked at her with disrespect and decided to ask her what position she meant. She was the first to attack, and she hadn't even considered the position of the guardian who was guarding the village. Iriella could barely stay on her feet and then informed that she had no other choice. She had to get the saint and bring him to the kingdom. It was all Fia's fault for ignoring all her requests. With a sad face, Ree looked at her once more before asking if she really wasn't going to apologize. But the girl was determined, so she closed her eyes and lowered her head before answering, saying that no apology she wasn't going to make. She began to analyze the situation, saying that she could have apologized if it were her misdeed. But the responsibility that lies upon her is very great indeed. One word could bring the wrath of God. Meanwhile, the sun had already begun to set over the horizon and night was coming, albeit slowly. Ray began to turn around and said that in that case, he was ready to end the conversation. Now let God give them another saint if they were not ready to accept his terms. The girl was shocked by this behavior, because she did not imagine that everything could be really so complicated. She was used to that everything always obeyed her. But it seems not this time. Ray looked at his friend and said that they needed to get back right away, as the keeper needed to be treated and helped. They started to walk over to Fia and tried to lift her up, which Iriella really didn't like very much. You could see she was clearly against it. She asked for her attention for a moment, trying to distract them from the activity. She said she may not be able to apologize, but she would do everything they asked, so she would ask him again to accept the offer. But Ray wants absolutely nothing more. He said that just an apology would be enough for him. The girl was very much frightened, for she realized that this could be very bad for her. But a decision had to be made right now. The boy had already taken the keeper in his arms and was about to leave with her. the moment the entire army of opponents stared them in the back. Well, in the meantime, the night was already approaching. His girlfriend also became curious that everything would be all right. When they had already moved a fair distance away, Ira still informed him that it was not too late to go back, for they would welcome him with open arms if he so desired. And the guy thought about it, but all already reported that he is not a bit sorry for this act. If she cannot apologize for her act, then all the more should not go there. Ira didn't understand why the guy was doing all this for them. They're not even from the same race. And he was amused and very pleased. He's just doing what he wants to do. If we have already touched on this topic, it would be foolish not to find out what he really wants. The answer is very simple: a happy life. His friend became nervous, for in that case he should definitely have become a saint. The guy kept walking along with his wounded friend and developing a dialogue. Yes, of course it would be nice. But being nervous about nothing and helping the sick was not exactly what he wanted to do for the rest of his life. The life he has now isn't really bad either, is it? He looked up at the sky and realized that finding happiness in the little things was his calling, and that was what would be enough for him. The girl looked at him with understanding and a smile, for there was indeed a great deal of wisdom in his words. They continued onward, and with every step, every minute, Ira was more and more amazed at the genius of this guy. A truly nocturnal atmosphere has already formed outside, as the sun will be fully behind the horizon in a few minutes, and the moon will replace it. Iriella continued to stand there with incomprehension and guilt, for through her they had just lost a saint. She began to remember the dialogue with him, also the moment when he started to leave, saying there was no point in continuing the conversation if she wasn't ready to apologize. She continued to stand there pondering all these phrases in her head, for had she really made a mistake? One of the priests ran up to her in a panic and tried to explain that perhaps there was some mistake here, as there was no way a saint could introduce himself in such a way. Iriella looked at her equipment and began to run that phrase over and over in her head. She then picked it up and threw it on the ground, which really shocked all the nearby team members. She ordered them all to go forward, exactly in the direction all these guys had gone, along with the saint. She was getting very curious. She seemed to have some sort of plan. After all she has to do is go to her elf village. The time was already quite late, and, as you can already understand it, so immediately at the entrance to the village, the guys were met by two strong elves who were very much worried about the guardian's condition and hoped very much that her injuries would really not be critical. Immediately afterward, they also saw Iriella walking alone towards that very village. But clearly, no one here ever wanted to see her. So the elves immediately drew their weapons and pounced on the girl. They ordered her to stop and under no circumstances dare to come close to the place. But she spread her arms and informed that she came to this land in peace, so she wants to meet the saint who is in their village. The elves were shocked by such a statement, for just as well they had never known before that they had some kind of saint in the settlement. But nevertheless, they still didn't fall for this provocation and request, because even if the girl is telling the truth, they have no right to let a person into the village. So she needs to leave now. If she comes even one more step, they will consider it as an attack. The girl realized everything, so she stopped and asked them to relay the information to Ray that she was here and waiting for him. The elves were emphatic. They made it clear that doing so would be impossible, so the girl needed to leave right now. But Iriella was persistent, so she asked for their help and to let her just wait for him here. She looked at the elves once more and promised that he would not harm them in any way. But they didn't want to listen to her, so they said it would be much better if the girl kept her distance and stood in the same place, or better yet moved farther away. Iriella lowered her head in acknowledgement, then indicated that she would not be moving from that spot. The elves just looked at her with misunderstanding, but everyone was already further away from reacting to it in any way. They began to wonder who this girl was talking about. Did it really come down to Ray? Meanwhile, the girl dropped to her knees and covered herself with her jacket, seemingly preparing for some kind of ritual. Some strange sounds began to appear near her cape. She knelt down and removed all her shoes in preparation for prayer, whereupon everything around her began to glow. She did it very long and intensely. It looked like she was trying to apologize and redeem herself. The elves began to worry a little, because they had never encountered such a thing before. So they consulted and decided that they should inform Ray about it. It was already dark in the village, and everyone was practically getting ready for bed. But right now, our guys didn't care about that at all. They took Fia into a room and began the healing process. After a while, things weren't so critical anymore, and finally Ree can take a break too. He felt very good about being able to help his friend, who was willing to give his life for him. But suddenly someone knocked on the door. And he opened the doors with a misunderstanding, and decided to find out what was going on and why wasn't he interested. Lion informed him that there was someone on the outskirts of the village who wanted to see him. Ray immediately realized what was going on and was a little perturbed since they were still trying to change his mind. The guy got very aggressive and started yelling, asking how much is there, 10 or 20? Well, the answer really surprised him. After he found out there was only one person there, he couldn't believe it. It was already very dark outside. It was deep night. The moment he approached the village guards, they greeted him and began to explain the situation. In front of that, they treated him hard and started asking where the culprit of the celebration had disappeared to. But it seems the guys had a good time without him. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of person was looking for him after all. The elves and simply pointed a finger in the direction of where the girl was standing, and informed him that she had been waiting for him all day, and had not stopped praying. He moved closer to you and was clearly expressing his displeasure. She was shocked that he had come to see her, but he wasn't ready to talk. He just wanted to know why she had come back here. Tears came to her eyes. All she wanted to do was just talk. Ray didn't believe these tears and talk, so he just calmly asked her once more if the girl was going to apologize. But the girl was also still talking about how she couldn't apologize, but instead she was willing to prove her sincerity to him. Ray waved his hands and became very aggressive again, because if the girl is not going to apologize, then everything she did was in vain. Doesn't she understand? She began to panic and tried to get up off the ground, trying to change Saint's mind that her feelings were indeed genuine. Which of course he began to doubt. She looked at him and informed him that her status did not allow her to apologize, but she could pray for all elves until they realized it. Ray looked at her and said that if she remained absent from her post like that, the Holy Kingdom would go looking for her, and because of that, they would be attacked again, and it would cause a lot of damage. Hadn't she even thought of that? She felt a little scared, but she understood everything. So she kept praying. She prayed to God that the Holy Kingdom would not take such measures. But Ray was skeptical. Did the girl really think he'd believe her so easily? But she convinced him that he should just take her word for it. And she pointed at Era, for if her words seemed to be a lie, then wouldn't an elven woman be able to recognize such a lie? Besides, they would all be able to overpower her. Ray was a little perturbed, for should one really believe her? Iriella realized that her arguments had become solid, so the guy practically trusted her already. He waved his finger and said that he would only let her do what she wanted once. After that, whatever they did to her was not her problem, and if the elves turned her around and told her to leave, she wouldn't dare disobey them. Iriella was very happy about this decision, for it was exactly what she wanted. A smile immediately appeared on her face, and the realization that she was now trusted. Ree immediately started walking towards the village, not even turning around or looking at the girl. But still, she had some points she would like to discuss with him. Ray turned around and asked what else she wanted. She was very embarrassed and didn't even know how to ask it properly. But still looking at him with her sweet eyes, she decided to find out where she could clean herself up. The guy was very angry because he had no idea that it would be so difficult, so he began to think to himself that he was already fed up with her. The dark night had passed and a bright sunny day had arrived. Iriella was still kneeling as well, only in a different place, and continued to thrash about. This was seen by the elves, who were puzzled as to why she was standing there. They just watched her and realized that if things did go on, she could spend the whole day there again. Didn't she have a problem sitting in one place for that long? At this point, Ray approached them and was about to head home, but the elves had a few more questions they wanted to know. They were a little perturbed. Was she really allowed to stay sitting here, after all? Would she be all right if she was allowed to sit like this for so long? Ray thought about it and didn't even know how to do the right thing, because the fate of the whole village might depend on his decision. But Iriella looked harmless enough, for she had been praying the whole time. It was safe to assume what kind of god would do such a thing for him. Underneath the shell of this beautiful girl, there was a very real monster. So she spent the whole day sitting in one place, and without rising at all. It was already getting dark outside again. Ray walked up to the house, and he was very happy about it, as it had been a long time since he had been here, and he already missed it. His parents, bringing the boy even a little scared because they had already considered him missing, but obviously did not expect to see him now, as they were engaged in their marital affairs. He smiled and told you to keep going. He wouldn't bother them. After that, he immediately closed his door and went to the other room. But his parents started yelling and making excuses, because it wasn't at all what he might have thought. He put his bag on the table and was really quite tired. So after such a hard day, Ray just collapsed on his bed and started to worry because he was really having a hard time. The guy immediately started remembering all of his past accomplishments and how he worked at his previous job as a doctor, which was still in his past life. But after all that, he remembered the Yura that reported that he should have gone to the Holy Realm. He remembered the girl informing him of this several times, even when they were healing the keeper. He asked Ira why she kept telling him this, to which she replied very simply, she thought he wanted it himself. She was very pleased that he cares about them, but he should not miss such a chance, because he got to the Holy Kingdom he will be able to learn medicine. So he started to get out of bed and remembered that he had made a promise to himself to learn how to cure any disease in this world. Immediately, he began to pack his briefcase and put various notes and books in there so that the training would go as fast as possible. He was very determined indeed, for he realized that he could not miss such a chance. The lamp on the table was still on, and it was already quite dark outside, but he needed to consult his parents about this decision. His parents began to throw dishes and get very angry, for they refused to understand and accept what he was now saying. They couldn't believe that he was really a saint, and his father was drooling after this flood of information. But they still didn't understand what he meant when he said he had to go to the Holy Kingdom. Ray was also thinking about all of this and trying to get the words right, but his look said it all for himself. His parents were shocked, especially his mom, who couldn't believe that he was being completely serious now, but they also wanted to know when he should go there. And there was also an equally important question: would the boy be able to come home? Ray exhaled and really started to get a little worried. After all, the departure was already planned for tomorrow. But the thing was that it might take a few years, but he would definitely come home. His mom started crying. His dad was also equally upset because they didn't want to accept this reality, because the guy would have to spend his whole life there as a saint. But Ray didn't worry about it, because he knew he would come back. So he promised his parents again that everything would be fine, and he would definitely come home. His mom ran to hug the guy, asking where could it be that a saint could come back again? But the father had already stopped worrying and just accepted this reality, asking his wife why she was crying. After all, she just needs to let him go and everything will be fine. He also started to get tears. He tried to calm her down. After all, they could take care of themselves and have a good time until Ray got back. So he gave his consent to the guy and told him to go, if that's what he wanted. Dad started to cry, but Ray tried to calm him down and tell him everything would be okay. He smiled and also started to cry a little, though he promised he'd come back in one piece. So it was definitely not something to worry about. In their big house, the conversation went on. For even as a small child, he had not roared like that. But now becoming a big boy, he cried? The next morning, when the sun came out again, action had to be taken. Iriella was still on her knees as well and kept praying that all would be well and trying to atone for all her sins. Suddenly her stomach started to hurt really badly, so she started grabbing at it, trying to reduce the pain. But it wasn't as simple as it seemed at first glance, as the girl hadn't eaten anything for a very long time. She was the one who slowly began to hallucinate. Ray approached her and informed her that everything in this field was edible, so the girl could eat absolutely anything she wanted. After saying that, he turned and walked away, saying that she could do exactly as she saw fit. She looked at these plants and was very much perturbed. Should she really be eating these? But there was no other choice, as starving to death was not a good idea, so she took and plucked those leaves, after which juice started running down her arms. It was quite a horrible and not quite pleasant sight, but there was no way to escape. Just imagine that this girl had been eating only in expensive restaurants all her life and had the appropriate attitude. She ate the product and immediately tried to cover her mouth and nose in order to avoid vomiting. But after a second of time, her eyes opened abruptly, and it seems the girl finally smelled that beautiful scent. She began to scream in pain, for this plant was very sharp and bitter. She was absolutely not used to eating such things. Her stomach was starting to really hurt and was giving out. She didn't have the energy to stand it anymore, so she held on to it with her last strength, trying not to vomit in the middle of the main entrance to the village. The elves watched the situation and were also very much surprised. For did the girl just eat the plant raw? But one of them was absolutely sure that people were omnivores, but he could not even imagine such a thing. The girl couldn't stand still anymore and started running around, so she asked the elves to give, or at least water. But suddenly a huge lake immediately appeared near her, in which she could quench her thirst, for all the water in it was fresh. Iriella started running there with her last strength to get rid of the pain somehow. The lake itself didn't mind welcoming her anymore, so it started to form big waves. And so very quickly the girl ran up to the right place and immediately fell into the water to drink and quench the thirst and burning that she had formed after the plant. Still, the question continued to plague her. Why hadn't the saint informed her that it was going to be so bad? Meanwhile, the weather was really beautiful. The sun was shining, and the birds were starting to sing. Nothing boded ill. After quenching her thirst, the girl collapsed, exhausted on the grass, in order to at least get some rest after what she had experienced. She was starting to have some not-so-good thoughts. Suggestions had already entered her head more than once about just giving up and leaving all of this. She lay there looking up at the sky, trying to find the answer to her questions there. Closing her eyes, Iriella began to worry very much. Was this really what she was capable of? She was convinced that everything was happening to her by God's will, so she had to be patient. After these words, a shadow covered her head and a familiar silhouette approached her, who, in a pleasant voice, told the saint to rise and go with him. It was Ray, who had returned from his home, and suggested that she get ready, in order to travel to the Holy Realm soon. He still continued to look at her, and asked that the girl begin to pack and prepare to go with him to the Holy Realm. Iriella looked at him and really couldn't even believe her eyes. Could it be that she could see him and the guy was now talking to her completely seriously and not joking? But Ray still wasn't ready to forgive Iriella, so he continued to talk rudely to her. He ordered her to get up and go to the Holy Realm. But she still didn't understand if that meant that the guy had finally forgiven her. He smiled and said that, of course it wasn't. But she hadn't even practically counted on it. Ray told her to get ready while he went to the village to say goodbye to his friends. The elfess greeted him. It might have looked like it was Fia, but no, it wasn't. So it was important for him to see her and see how she was doing. And he was very surprised, because she already knew about his coming and was expecting him. Besides, recently the elves reported that Fia had woken up, so it was necessary to see her as soon as possible. They walked up to her cabin together, in which they gave her first aid, trying to heal Fia as soon as possible. The guy was very excited, as he was getting very close to seeing his girlfriend. Fia was really surprised to see him, even though she knew Ree was coming. It was much better visually, and she looked really pretty, you'd have to agree. Ray was a little embarrassed even, but he still picked up on the fact that it was really nice to see her here, because she was finally waking up. He approached her and wanted to ask her how she was feeling. She talked to him nicely and was very happy about the question and his visit. Ira was also standing behind her and was very happy that the guy had gotten back so quickly, and also noted that she was very happy that Fia had recovered so quickly and was already feeling much better. Ray didn't even notice her right away, so he asked her if she really cared about her friend that much, being here all the time. But she exhaled and said that for a high elf, caring for her people was a common thing. Suddenly the keeper was very frightened and began to grab her blanket, for she had just been struck by her abuser, which she obviously could not have expected. But Iriella asked her not to move, for her wounds had not yet fully recovered. Ray was already standing with his backpack, which was immediately noticed by everyone around him. His girlfriend got really excited, because he's finally got his head around it. And it seems like he's ready to move on. Ray smiled and said that he planned to go to the Holy Kingdom as he had been told, for it was indeed foolish to miss such an opportunity. Ira got a little embarrassed and let him know that she was really happy to hear that, even though she realized that he would be leaving very soon. Fia started screaming at this and tried to get out of bed abruptly. She clearly didn't expect to hear such a thing. But she remembered that Ira was near her, so she quickly calmed down and apologized to her, because she didn't want to behave like that, especially in her presence. But Ira was not embarrassed by this behavior at all. Ree also smiled, then began to parody the girl, saying if there were any questions or points of interest, she could safely ask them. Ira was very much surprised by such a thing and got a little angry, for was he really parodying her? For how dare he drive himself in such a manner? So Ray immediately apologized for such behavior. His girlfriend was looking at him, trying to find out if he was really leaving. So he hadn't planned to stay here with them? Fia Era's words really hurt a lot. She really didn't understand how he could do such a thing. Would he really go with those people from the Holy Kingdom? Ray also thought about it. Not that he had decided to do this because of their arrival here, but he had considered going there much earlier. Did he really plan to leave them for a long time? He didn't know the answer to that question himself, so he said that he would probably only be there for a few years. His girlfriend didn't even know what to say. It was obvious that she wasn't ready to accept this reality, just like his parents. Then she smiled and informed him that it really wasn't that much. So she wished him good luck and told him to have a good trip and rest, and to promise her that he would definitely come back. He started grabbing the back of his head and talking about how elves have a slightly different perception of time. Ira also asked if they had finished their conversation. If so, she would like to have a private conversation with him as well. Ray looked at his friend one more time and said goodbye to her, telling her that they would definitely see each other soon. They went outside and were already approaching the house that Ira already lived in. She came closer to him and told him she wanted to give him something, but asked the guy not to refuse the gift under any circumstances. Ray was very surprised, because he really likes surprises like this. So he wondered what she was offering him. The girl asked, holding out her hand, after which she grabbed it. Ira squeezed her very tightly and informed her she was passing a piece of herself to him. It would serve as proof that she was always by his side. Suddenly, his hand began to glow. Everything began to transform, and the process of transferring magical power began. Ray didn't realize what was happening to his hand, but it felt really good. On it seems to have begun to form the very real seal that belongs to the elves, which has magical properties. His friend began to smile and informed him that he could now turn to her when he needed help. It was obvious that the process of transferring the magic had a very strong effect on the guy's condition, because he was really starting to lose consciousness a bit. But after a minute he came to his senses, and he was already feeling much better. He started to panic, because he remembered that elves used to take people as slaves. So maybe Ira had enslaved him right now, so he really started to panic about it. Because would he be enslaved until his death? She calmed him down and told him that she didn't know exactly what he was up to. But it wasn't it. It was just a piece of her. Her seal. So don't worry about it. It is a seal created by her magic, and she has asked that it be considered a gift in the form of hers, meaning she is now willing to obey it. She smiled and said that she would always be there for him now, so if he needed any help, for him not to be shy and turn to her, let him remember that and be careful. Ray looked at his hand that was enchanted with the seal and was very much pleased. He was tithe very pleasant and unaccustomed. The guy deep down was very happy, but was still afraid to convey that emotion yet. But he could not resist for long, and after a while he smiled and was very happy with such a gift. It was already getting dark outside again, and deep night was approaching. The villagers were beginning to get ready to go to bed again. Iriella was also watching the whole situation and was very pleased with this outcome. She quietly followed the guy and smiled the whole time. She was tensely pleased that he was walking along with her. He thought this tithe very strange, so he turned to her and asked if she was really that happy, because he had never seen such strong emotions before. Of course, shouldn't she be happy that she would soon return to God? But Ray rolled his eyes and realized that it seemed that these days away from the temple were really hard on Iriella. And she looked at him and said they should go as fast as they could before it was night yet. Ray looked at the village once more and was indeed very upset, for these villagers had really given him a lot. The sun was already setting over the horizon and the land was preparing for midnight. Ray continued to watch the sunset and admire these beautiful surroundings. Iriella walked up to him and asked if he regretted the decision. But Ray was indeed a little upset, for he realized that he would still be able to come back here anyway. But something was nagging him. He looked at the girl and wanted to check with her again. Would all those conditions he had spoken of really be fulfilled? But the girl smiled and then said that about the first one still needs some thought and discussion. But the rest she will do. This made Ray very angry, and she could see that he really didn't trust her and didn't want to accept her. Maybe it wasn't too late to go back. But the decision had already been made, whereupon he threw on his bag and ordered the girl to go as soon as possible, which she was very much pleased to do. They walked together and realized that they had a very long way to go indeed. Their road also passed the large house where Ray was born and spent his entire childhood. While they were walking, the guy decided to look at the map to make sure they were going in the right direction. Besides, Iriella had changed the place they would need to visit before going to the Holy Kingdom, so they needed to explore it as soon as possible. But to begin with, they will need to go on a royal journey. That this is still a mystery. But the girl was very much surprised. All the matter is that the accompanying squad is in the royal capital called Cilia. So they need to first meet with them, and only then they will be able to direct the Holy Kingdom. It would be good to continue on the path to begin with, but Ree still didn't understand why Iriella was so agitated. The thing is, it takes about 3 days to get to the royal capital, but using mana, you can get there much faster, in about 1 day, right? Need to relax a bit since he'd have to run all day. This procedure really surprised the girl, so she didn't hold back and asked what the saint was doing now. She smiled and was very much surprised at the same time, for was he really going to run all the way? Ray was also a little shocked, but still tried to convince the girl that it was faster that way, wasn't it? Iriella was very surprised at this suggestion, because even her divine power had been corrected, and Uri didn't have divine power yet, so he wouldn't be able to pull this off in any way. He thought about it for a moment and said that it would probably be much faster to get there with his mana flows than on a horse. But why do it? After all, the girl had even bought a horse to make it much more comfortable for them to get around. But he couldn't ignore that, so Ray exhaled and smiled. For now, he wouldn't have to waste his strength. Iriella said she only bought 1 horse to save money for emergencies. No big deal. She was very worried about whether the guy would mind, but unfortunately he doesn't know how to ride horses anyway. So they sat down together and started driving in the right direction, where Ray kept hugging the girl to fall. Their journey was indeed very long, because it passed through various mountains and difficult to access areas of land, where without a horse, would have been very difficult indeed. After they had traveled quite a bit for the day, it was late at night, so they needed to make a quick stop and spend the night in order to start moving with renewed vigor the next morning. It didn't take long for the guy to start using his superpowers, which he had already mastered at a fairly young age, so he heated his hand and made it sparkle. Seconds later, a fire had already formed, which began to water all those branches and provide heat. The girl was very surprised by this, because then it is possible that the guy can just activate magic by saying just 1 word. He is very good for his age. Maybe he is a mage of the 2nd circle? But it made her feel really good about it, so he smiled even though he said it was no big deal. Whereupon he decided to make another impression on the girl, and with his index finger, he pointed to the pot and filled it with water. After he was done with all that, he started pulling out plants to make something to eat from. Iriella was very much surprised, for she was absolutely convinced that it should not be added there, as she already remembered her bitter experience with this plant. This surprised the guy very much, because why does she refuse this ingredient so much? It is quite tasty. It is only worth a taste. But the girl was very nervous, because she remembers that it is very spicy and bitter. Ray smiled, for did she really eat those leaves? That is, not just the branch itself. He found it very funny, for the girl really did. After which he had to explain to her that people usually only ate the branch, though the leaves contained many more nutrients. The girl was very much surprised at such a thing, for they are indeed too bitter and spicy to eat. But why is all this information he is talking about only now? After the preparation of this dish was over, Ray held it out for her to appreciate how it should ideally be. The flavor would be different many times over. She thanked him and took her portion, and already wanted to taste it as soon as possible. After looking at this dish, she concluded that it was indeed very much like a standard soup. She was still scared to eat it, but visually it looked quite appetizing, especially since it had a really nice smell to it. She took a spoon and decided to stir it around a bit. After that, she wanted to try it as soon as possible, and it surprised her a lot. Iriella was very much shocked at such an ingenious preparation of the dish, laying down accolades that she had made it to the culinary talent shows, for she had never eaten anything tastier before. Ray wondered very much, for why was she eating it so fast? Do they not feed them in the Holy Kingdom? It's certainly a lot scarier than it looks, So the guy recommended eating this dish a little slower, as it can be a major stomachache afterward. The next morning, they set out on the road, where they were already greeted by the palace and the beautiful city that was built near it. The market is incredibly large. This is to be expected, as this is the royal road, meaning it is exactly the same terrain as the outskirts. And so the boys had already arrived at the castle, where their escorts were surely already waiting for them. Ray looked at the whole environment and wondered very much. He was really enjoying watching it all. After all, it was his first time here. So he was still a little worried and hoped that nothing would happen. And so they had already reached the main entrance to the castle, where two butlers were waiting for them to open the gates. They greeted the girl and were glad she had come. The butlers were only so friendly to the girl, so they asked her to introduce the young man who sat on the back of the horse. Iriella smiled and reported that he was also, indeed, a saint. But she felt a little awkward and funny, so she decided to clarify his holiness with the guy himself. He was a little perplexed, but still said himself that he was a saint, and his name was Ray. The butlers immediately apologized for such a stupid question, and of course let them pass on. The guys walked into this palace and were really quite shocked by such luxury. The priests were already at the entrance and bent their heads in respect, welcoming the saint and the holy man to the castle, for they had come such a long way. The girl reported that she had finished her mission that Celia had given her, and they intended to leave this castle tomorrow, so she ordered them to contact her country and notify them of their return. The priests obeyed her and said they would inform the Light Kingdom of their arrival. At this point, the girl smiled and informed the guy that he could now go and get some rest. For this, she would guide him to a resting place. And so they opened the doors, which were much cooler than the very elf village. His room was like a very real palace. Though, yes, you are right. It is indeed a real palace. Ray was very much shocked, because this is really a real luxury. He could not even imagine to be in such a place, because his previous life he did not have the opportunity to even visit such apartments, all because he was constantly busy. Iriella approached him to ask if he liked everything. Well, the answer, as you can imagine, was as obvious as possible. You should get some rest, so I will go, Iriella said. And then Ray was a little puzzled, for they were to go to the Holy Kingdom tomorrow morning, and would not stay long, would they? But she left the question unanswered, and only said that they would see each other tomorrow morning. The guy was very much alarmed by this, for was she really up to something? He stood there puzzled and really trying to figure out what had just happened. Maybe she wanted to set him up somehow, or do something unpleasant to him. But there wasn't much time for negative thoughts, as he was really already tired. So he decided to sit down on his bed and change into his pajamas. Ray lay down and decided to relax, for tomorrow he would indeed be traveling to the Holy Realm. He closed his eyes and began to daydream a little, for tomorrow he would have to live there. But he still wondered if his living conditions would be much different. The next day morning came, and it was time to get ready for a new day. Ray changed his clothes, and immediately afterward he heard banging on his door, which should have woken him up, but he was already awake. Iriella went over to him and asked if Ray was really awake already. But he was still having trouble opening his eyes and also wanted to sleep some more, but still self-informed to move on as quickly as possible. The girl smiled, for if the guy was ready too, it was time to move out. She was very happy and dressed very differently, although the new image also suited her very well. Perhaps she wanted to make a good impression on the guy and please him with her beauty. But he didn't care. He wasn't even listening to what she was telling him and was constantly thinking about his own, so he didn't even pay attention to it. But it didn't last long. He still had to tense up as he didn't fully understand where they were starting to go. Was it really to the king? Her eyes began to shine like diamonds. Iriella couldn't get excited about the future event. for very soon they would see the most important person on the continent. Ray looked at his room and didn't understand why it was necessary to do this, since they usually warned about this kind of thing in advance, at least before going to bed. But Ariella reassured him and informed him that everything would go well. They would just say hello and go, informing him of his departure. Ray grabbed his head and tried to explain to her that it wasn't the main thing right now. If he knew he was going to meet the king, he would at least learn some manners. The girl continued to smile and informed him that she purposely didn't want to do it, because she was worried that it might disturb his sleep. That wasn't a problem, right? He was already uncomfortable watching all this, as such suspicious courtesy on her part was already beginning to arouse a great deal of suspicion indeed, and was starting to get tiresome. The doors opened and the butlers greeted the boys once again. Ray was a little embarrassed, for the conversation immediately began with a discussion of his new position, where the king began to wonder if he was really the newly elected saint. He was still quite young for a king of Cilia, but he was still very strong, though not quite wise, and his name was Theogard.